There it is.
Someone said that's why.
There, it's recording. Okay, Harjeet, we're ready. I'm not going to do much of a preamble for this, just get things rolling. So I'd like to introduce Harjeet Grewal. It's a great pleasure to have him. He's always been a really friendly presence in various conferences and gatherings, seminars, and things like that that we've attended together over the years. Learned a tremendous amount from Harjeet, and owe a lot to him for even just some of the stuff that's on our syllabus, through his suggestions that they got put on there. So, so this is the second Aurora lecture this quarter, and really an honor to have you, Harjeet, join us, especially on this occasion where we're reading the Janamsakhis together in this class. So Dr. Harjeet Singh Grewal is an adjunct faculty member at the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary, Canada, where he has been helping to create a Sikh Studies research endowment in partnership with Calgary's Sikh community. Harjeet focuses on Asian religions with a specialty in Sikhi, the more pre-modern term for Sikhism. His research interests include critical religious philosophy and literary theory and deep pluralism. Harjeet is currently working on 2 book projects. The first is based on his dissertation research about the Janamsakhi literature and Sikh thought. It is called Janamsakhi Literature and Sikh Epistemology, Narrative, Allegory, and Thought in the Sikh Tradition. The second book, co-authored with Sara Hakim Grewal, looks at the experience of diaspora through popular culture. And I was really fascinated with the presentation that he gave at the University of Minnesota or Michigan a few years back. And hopefully you can give that for cultural studies, you and Sara at some point. That project is entitled Dislocatia, Deterritorialization in Diaspora and Sikh Hip Hop, The Varieties of Sikh Experience, subtitle. His PhD is from Asian Languages and Cultures from the University of Michigan. And I think that's about all for the introduction. So I'll hand it over to you, Harjeet. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Sahota, and appreciate the invite. I'm happy to be here sharing this lecture about the Janamsakhis and Sikh epistemology. So I will actually just kind of a rejoinder to begin with. If the feed gets disrupted in any way, just let me know and I can turn the video off because I am on Wi-Fi and I know sometimes it's inconsistent. So just to kind of, if you can flag that, then I'll just turn the video off and the audio usually works better. So,
okay, cool.
Yeah, so the agenda for today in our lecture here is I'll be covering in the first section some notes about the Guru Granth Sahib and Sikh textuality as an outgrowth of this central text in the Sikh tradition. The second section will go into some of the details about the Janamsakhis specifically, and I'm assuming some knowledge based on the readings you guys have had. And then section 3, I'll talk about the historiographical debate regarding the Janamsakhis that happens in the 20th century mostly, and then move on from there to end to give some ideas about why we should look at the Janamsakhis rather than strictly from a historiographical perspective and trying to incorporate literary theory and epistemology in order to deepen our understanding about not just the genre itself, but also about Sikh textuality and the tradition more generally. Just in terms of a short introduction, so from the mid-1500s, the Sikh tradition starts producing some of the earliest vernacular prose texts in Northwestern South Asia. The Sikh tradition is part of a larger move of vernacularization that's happening in the early modern period, and it's one of the earlier traditions to kind of move into this realm. So it's interesting that you have a poetic and metrical based text like the Guru Granth Sahib, but shortly thereafter, as we'll see, we start moving into prose, which typically is thought to have been something that really develops during the colonial period, but we see these early versions here in the Sikh tradition. the Janamsakhi manuscripts are basically compendiums of anecdotes about Guru Nanak, who starts the Sikh tradition. And the 20th century, as I will talk about more, really kind of builds this debate about how best to use the Janamsakhis, and really kind of is focused on a categorization debate, whether we should call them biography or hagiography. And again, I'll give more details in a little while about that. And then again, I will argue that the literary perspective helps us kind of think about and understand more about Sikh textuality and how it enters into narrative forms in the Sikh tradition. And I think this is interesting because we're learning more and more in terms of even like with traditions here in North America with indigenous peoples about how storytelling and narrative is actually central to how people understood who and how they are, or what scholars might refer as the ontologies of different groups of people. So this is interesting for me in that regard as well, that it can speak to how non-philosophical, as per our modern understanding, non-philosophical ways of writing that do speak about philosophical things. So the Guru Granth Sahib and Sikh textuality. So there are four main texts in the Sikh tradition. First and foremost, you have the Shri Guru Granth Sahib. And then there's three other texts that remain kind of important to the modern day, and are actually, some of these are debated quite regularly about what their role is in the tradition. The Janamsakhis are one of those. And actually the second one here, the Dasam Granth Sahib, is also a matter of significant debate within the tradition. The poetry of Bhai Gurdas is actually quite legitimately understood to be a central part of the tradition, as per the modern renderings of Sikhism. So I'll talk a little bit about the Shri Guru Granth Sahib and then move on to make some general comments about Sikh textuality that are connected to this central text. So the Shri Guru Granth Sahib is, by all estimations, the central text in the Sikh tradition. It's a canonical text. Again, in modern scholarly understandings, is often spoken about as the scripture of the Sikhs as well. So this text is compiled by the fifth Badshah, or the sovereign, the fifth sovereign, Guru Arjan Sahib. And initially it's called the Ad Guru Granth Sahib, or the first book. And this is completed, it's a 5-year project, and it's completed in August of 1604. Alongside the project of compiling the central writings of the gurus and other thinkers in the Northwestern region, Guru Arjan is simultaneously undergoing a construction project where he's building a large tank. And in the center of that tank is the building we now call, at least outside of Punjab, is popularly known as the Golden Temple, but Sikhs know as the Darbar Sahib. So he was building the Darbar Sahib and compiling the Ad Guru Granth Sahib over a same 5-year span. They're completed in August in 1604, and there's actually a ceremonial procession that goes from where the Guru Granth Sahib was being compiled and takes it over to the Darbar Sahib for installation. This was kind of a ceremonial procession where there was music. The text was covered with a shatar, or a kind of a umbrella type thing to make sure it's shaded from the sun. And there was a formal procession with music, which is actually still done regularly every day with the Guru Granth Sahib as it moves from its place of rest to the main hall in a Gurdwara, which is a place where Sikhs come to congregate. And then in the evening, it's taken back, and both times it's brought in and taken back. This ceremony where the Guru Granth Sahib was installed is actually recreated by the Sikhs who are gathered every day in different parts of the world to partake in this. So you can see this is part of a living tradition. It's actually central to the way the text itself is understood in the Sikh tradition, and I'll get to that in a second here. Later on, in about a century, the last Badshah, Guru Gobind Singh Ji, actually opens up the canon, if you will, in 1708 and adds his father's verses, improves the structure somewhat of the text, and edits the earlier compositions. And we can actually read that in the present version of the text today. It'll sometimes say corrected, or the word should is written in there. And that's actually from this second phase of opening up and adding things to it. This is often understood by academics as a response to increasing factionalization and sectarianism that was happening between that 1604 date and the 1708 date. And people, there were other versions of the Guru Granth Sahib that had been used by sectarian groups, and things that kind of encroached into the text that weren't originally there. So Guru Gobind Singh Ji sought to address that by creating the 1708 text. And shortly thereafter, the text then is officially called the Guru of the Sikhs. So with the completion of this, then you have the kind of formation of a central aspect of Sikh textuality. So here's just a quick image of a rendering or imagination of that moment of installing the Granth. Here in the background is the Darbar Sahib. And you have here, again, this is just in an artist's imagination, but this is by Gurdas. He was helping Guru Arjan, who's in the back here. And Baba Buddha is actually the one carrying. He was a Sikh, one of the earliest Sikhs of Guru Nanak, and was helping as well with this text. So you can kind of see how this is still a living aspect of the tradition. And again, you can visualize what I was describing in terms of how this was carried over. The people here in the front, it got cut off a bit, but there's instruments and stuff in the front here being used. And you can see the drum right there as well. So again, this is the most important text of the tradition, and it's actually again, the idea of scripture doesn't fully carry the context of the importance, and this is a living embodied guru for Sikhs. Sikhs see this as an embodied guru, and they treat it that way, and this should be understood not just simply as ritualized kind of religious behavior. Or religious practice, but something that is, what I would argue, is central to the way Sikh texts were used up until the colonial encounter. It's the center of Sikh knowledge production or epistemology, and its language is internally or self-referentially referred often to as Gurbani, although linguistically it contains multiple languages and regional dialects that were prevalent in and amongst that northwestern region. Gurbani highlights the transformative play of lingual practices then that were promoted by the 10 Badshahs of the Sikhs, so the lineage of 10 gurus, is more commonly understood. Here is just a quick example of, in a modern context, the placement of the guru in the court, the darbar of the Sikhs. So this is what we understood to be a Gurdwara is actually for Sikhs a court wherein the sovereign guru, here being the text itself, presides, and people come to congregate and be in the presence of this sovereign. Again, to really understand this, you have to understand that this is a living body and not just a text. And that kind of shows how it's placed ceremonially. So the contents of the Guru Granth Sahib, it's a large text, 1,430 pages, metric poetic compositions, and there's other people beyond the 10 gurus who were included in this, 13 thinkers, sants, bhagats, and fakirs. The 6 of the 10 gurus wrote, possibly 7. There is a debate about whether the last Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, included one of his verses in here. And there's 23 butts or bards. This was a group of composers that would come to courts in northwestern India, and their job was to kind of recite the praises or and keep track of the events of the sovereigns and live in the courts and be around the sovereigns all the time. And so the poetry from the pots is also included. There's 23 of those. The organization of the text itself, there's different aspects of the organization. When we read in scholarly writing, we mostly have scholars mention the rag section, but there's actually 3 sections of the text. In the beginning, there's the liturgy, or the things that Sikhs would recite regularly every day, at different times, coinciding with dawn and dusk, basically. The rag section is the largest section, so obviously it's retained a lot of attention scholarly. And the last section is actually additional compositions referred to as shaloks or suvayas that were not included or did not fit into the rag section. And so again, there's not a lot of discussion in the current literature about why these were added as a third section. So the rag section itself is internally has a complicated structure as well. So the rag, in a very general way, is a metrical structure. And there's 31 main rags, 60 rags in terms of sub-rags and rags. So rags are thought about as in a familial context in South Asia. And further to that, within each raga, you have internal organization where the compositions will often start with the first Guru, Guru Nanak, and proceed numerically from the first to the second to the third. And then after that, you see the writings of the Bhagats, the sons and fakirs, typically in an order as well. And then from there, internally, the writings of each guru is actually further regularized as well, so that you can kind of anticipate within each guru's section what types of writing to expect as you read forward. So it's actually a quite structured and formal text if you look at just the way it's put together. Sikh textuality then. So what is Sikh textuality and how is it related to the Guru Granth Sahib? So Sikh textuality encompasses multiple aspects of the practice and understandings around writing in the Sikh tradition. Really, this starts with the creation of the Ad Guru Granth Sahib. Before the colonial period, there was a tradition of treating many of the important texts, the 4 that I mentioned, alongside other ones, in a very similar way that the Guru Granth Sahib was treated. Mostly the distinction being the height at which these texts were put in terms of how they were formally placed in sacred space or in a Gurdwara. So understanding Gurbani, the Guru and the Guru Granth Sahib reveals understudied facets of textuality in the tradition. And this is just a quote here in Punjabi or in Gurmukhi to give you an idea of what this is. So it says here, Bani Guru, Guru hai Bani, Bani Vich Bani Amrit Sare. So assuming no one understood what I said, so to translate that really quickly, it says that the Bani, so Gurbani, the writings, are the Guru. The Guru is the Bani or Gurbani, and in Gurbani is something called Amrit, which is actually thought of as an elixir or kind of a transformative medium. Sometimes in the early modern period, you hear about it as in Arabia in terms of alchemy, it was referred to as al-aksar, the elixir. Also as Abe Hayat. In Gurbani, in the writings of the Guru Granth Sahib, this is often a way to refer to the writing itself and the names that are used to refer to the creator and how those names have transformative potential for practitioners. So again, that quote here is really nice because it gives you the full sense of what this text meant and what it's meant to do. So I argue that writings like the Janamsakhis are extensions of the function of the Guru Granth Sahib. So again, it's important to understand this, and it's also important to think about how the colonial encounter reconfigures texts in a more modern understanding of a medium which we read to develop an understanding of ourselves, the world, people around us, etc., etc. So that kind of comes in through the colonial period. All right, so section 2 with the Janamsakhis. So Janamsakhis is one of the most popular genres. This is a living genre. It's still used, and many Sikhs are familiar with some of the stories, but they may not know the term Janamsakhi itself. Janamsakhis are anecdotes about Guru Nanak. He's the key protagonist in these. Again, they're quasi-prose analogies or aphorisms. And what you see here is Guru Nanak accompanied by his adherents or disciples, often meeting other people, etc. And you kind of, along with the journey, hearing the conversations, the encounters, etc. So the other important part of the Janamsakhis as a text is that they include heavy referencing of the Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Nanak characteristically is silent or sparse in speech, but when he does speak, he often speaks through the author's use of reference to Gurbani. So the compositions from Guru Granth Sahib are actually the speech in many ways of Guru Nanak. In terms of what we know about the authorship, there's not a lot we can say. There's different suggestions, and we know certain authors, but often authors, as per the tradition, were self-effacing, so they didn't write their names down when they created these texts. However, there is a frame story that talks about the second Guru, the Guru who followed right after Guru Nanak, wanting to know more about the life of Guru Nanak, because he came into Guru Nanak's life when Guru Nanak was quite mature and in living a settled life. And he didn't know about the earlier parts of Guru Nanak's life. So there's a kind of self-reference, self-understanding within the text that it was Guru Angad, the second Guru, who wanted to know more about the first Guru and his travels, his early life as a child, etc., that actually prompted the creating of the Janamsakhis. Later, we have rival groups using the Janamsakhis. This is actually right around Guru Arjan's time period of the fifth Guru. So we do know that Mehervan, rival of the Guru, actually created his own Janamsakhi. And around the time of Guru Gobind Singh in the 1700s, there's another attempt by a disciple of Guru Gobind Singh, by Mani Singh, to create, again, for the same reasons that the Guru Granthas we written, to rewrite the Janamsakhis in order to remove some of the spurious material. So there are some names along the way, but in terms of the entire archive, we don't have the full extent of who the authors were. Here, again, with the inclusion of other material, especially with the Meherban version, it's not always certain that all the references or all the verses that are written in the Janamsakhis actually come from the Guru Granth Sahib. So many modern scholars have done a good job to kind of work through that and have tried to edit things. But I think it's important to recognize that it's part of the creative aspect of the text itself to try to incorporate other verses and things like that into it. And that this was an expansive genre and it was being used in different ways. So rather than getting bogged down into kind of ideological debates, I think it's good to kind of think about these things as, as the genre evolves and moves, over centuries, people start using it in different ways. And some of that was to kind of imagine what the Guru might have said and write verses in that way. And there are internal marks here that differentiate when it's in these instances, whether it's the Guru Granth Sahib being quoted or whether it's a verse that's kind of made up. So again, if you read them really carefully, you can kind of see that the authors were trying to make suggestions that this wasn't really a verse from the Guru Granth Sahib. So basically, what we have here then, I argue, is an early commentary on the Guru Granth Sahib. What's interesting, though, is that the commentary is actually happening through storytelling. And so you're kind of, I think as scholars anyways, or for me personally, you're left with the thought, well, how is this, what was the function of this and how was this created and why weren't people using typical forms of religious commentary, philosophy, et cetera, et cetera? Why is one of the earliest ways of doing this literary? All right, so if we look at some of the sequences themselves, what we notice is Guru Nanak is characterized in a certain way. He's often silent, he's contemplative, he's disengaged, and listless in the sense of he moves around a lot and he doesn't stay in one place, and is very intelligent and educated. There's mentions of him learning many of the academic or formal languages of his day, including Persian, Sanskrit, and possibly Arabic, as he traveled through the Middle East and went over into what is today Saudi Arabia, down through Africa as well. And the interests often of Guru Nanak are written about in a way that they were beyond everyday kind of rote education or kind of the material concerns, or kind of what I would say today we could think of as kind of STEM concerns that we put into education. So Guru Nanak wasn't necessarily concerned with the immediate applicability of knowledge. He was looking at a kind of higher form of knowledge and thinking about the impacts of that and what it does to us as humans if we engage in this higher form of knowledge, which again, I would argue that the Guru Granth Sahib represents for the Sikh community today. In a typical Sakhi anecdote, what you see, so the Sakhis are actually a single anecdote. The Janamsakhis is the compendium. So each Sakhi in itself is self-enclosed. Something happens, it's like kind of like a chapter, if you want to imagine it that way today. These are anecdotes. And if we look at the arc of each of these, we can kind of see in the beginning, Guru Nanak typically meets somebody, or there's some type of a curious, quixotic event that happens that kind of starts a conversation with somebody. So that's kind of the event part of it. Nanak does something unexpected or provocative. This can be a phrase. He could move something. There's versions where he's, the shade of a tree is what prompts a conversation. So again, the dialogue is the larger part of any individual Sakhi. And within that dialogue, as I mentioned, it's actually Guru Nanak's voice often being written into the story or the anecdote through the Guru Granth Sahib, or a Shabad or some Gurbani from that central text. Guru Nanak recites that, and then the stranger has a kind of, epiphany, or kind of it's a learning moment, if you want to think of it that way, in less kind of religious terms. And they have a conversation, and it kind of creates a desire typically on the part of the interlocutor to spend more time and learn more from Guru Nanak. So I've argued in other ways that this kind of is actually a framework for what Sikhs should do with Gurbani as well. So this is kind of a framework for how Sikhs should behave and treat, the Guru Granth Sahib. It's kind of a prolonged engagement, a desire to learn, etc. And the text or the writing being the central place where that happens. All right, so if you look at the Janamsakhis as a full compendium, you can kind of see that there's four main periods in Guru Nanak's life: birth, adolescence, travels, settled life, and death. So again, this in some way would look like the arc of a novel as well. And the main kind of driver of the story are the travels, or kind of the adventures that the Guru Nanak has over a course of little over a decade. And so these narratives then kind of as a kind of full compiled text actually do have kind of the aspects of narrative and storytelling that we would expect even kind of in modern stories, right? So I mean, it's important to recognize this as well as we shift to looking at the debate that was happening in terms of how to look at the texts and use them historically, which is what we'll do now. So the historiographical debate. So just to kind of sum it up, really, this was a debate that happened between the 60s and continued into the late 90s. The text that you read by Nikki Guninder was actually one of the last pieces of literature that actually formally was taking up this debate. So on the one side, there was a question of using the Janamsakhis as biographical sources, On the other side, it was thought that they should be best thought of as hagiographical sources. And I'll explain what that is here in the slide in a second. But largely what this becomes is really a quest for the historical Guru Nanak. And any historical quest for a religious founder, as we've seen in the past, has always been fraught, it's difficult, and it winds up actually being inconclusive. And it's kind of, I would say it's arguable what the benefit of these things are in terms of how much we get of the actual historical knowledge. Nonetheless, I would say they're worthy tasks to do. So on the biographical side here, the Janamsakhis is actually translated the word itself as the life of Guru Nanak or life of Nanak. Janam means birth. And then based on the content, as I showed you a couple slides back, because the focus is Guru Nanak and you have this kind of arc of a life, it's kind of glossed into the life of Guru Nanak, and it makes it kind of a biography of Guru Nanak. This is important, again, in the mid-20th century, because people are in new national contexts. Colonialism is on the retreat, supposedly, and there's Pakistan and India being created in 1947. And so by the 60s, Sikhs that have moved primarily from Pakistan in quite violent and traumatic ways are kind of trying to settle into a new national context. So this debate about history, who we are, etc., is actually quite understandable. However, the mythic or literary aspects of the text are always a kind of thorn in the side of scholars who want to strictly look at the text in terms of history and biography. Some of the way that's resolved or attempted to be resolved is to look at them in terms of hagiography. So hagiography is usually kind of the way people talk about religious figures or saints in terms of glorifying the persona or the charisma of a religious figure. So the way to deal with the mythic material then is to translate Janamsakhis as the myth of Nanak rather than the life of Nanak. And then you can render this into a hagiographical space. The argument then becomes, rather than looking at Guru Nanak's life, we should look at the life of the community and how the community was forming its self-understanding around the idea of Guru Nanak as a savior or an intercessor for pious Sikhs. So kind of like if you pray to Guru Nanak, which Sikhs don't do, then he will save you. And again, what I just said there is Sikhs don't do that is one of the problems with this theory that Sikhs don't pray in that way for intercession by the Gurus. So ultimately, this debate is unresolved. However, scholars in the West primarily just keep using the term hagiography, and the term biography just kind of falls to the wayside, really. However, if you look at the debate itself, the proponents in hagiography really kind of struggled to make the argument that this was a formation around a cult of a persona. And the Janamsakhis actually counter that, because there's many examples where when Guru Nanak is asked for, if I was, just to kind of, make a example here, if I was sitting in front of Guru Nanak and I said, "Oh, Guru Nanak, please save me," or I was praying to Guru Nanak and I was saying, "Guru Nanak, please save me, I'm a terrible human being. Please kind of, intercede on my behalf and I can get salvation." If that was the Sakhi, and you do see these in the Sakhis, Guru Nanak says, "No, I cannot save you. You need to do these other things, and then maybe you can be saved when you pass on," etc. So it's always in the texts themselves contradicted anyways. So it's kind of important, I think, to think about this as well. And the same thing with the hagiography or the biography perspective. While it's important to kind of be able to talk about Guru Nanak, the texts themselves, simply calling the Janamsakhis biography is problematic, and it needs to be addressed in terms of how they're categorized. Because we should try to be, as scholars, as genuine with the categorizations of texts, especially when they're coming from other traditions, and do justice to those things. So some of the other problems mentioned on the slide here, they minimize the literary language, but also virtually ignore the Shabads from the Guru Granth Sahib. So modern Janamsakhis written today, in light of this debate, actually don't include any of the references to the Guru Granth Sahib. They're simply narrative prose texts. So again, you can see how the change happened over the colonial period to privilege prose over poetry or meter, and in doing so, privilege history as we understand it today. This is just a quick slide to show you some of the faces of the debate. So the biography proponents really kind of, is actually Nikki Guninder's father, Harbans Singh, on the left here in the kind of drawing, who really advocated that. A bunch of other Punjab-based scholars were alongside him and quite vociferous on that. The scholar here was based in different parts of the quote-unquote West, as we say. And his name is Hugh MacLeod. And in the background is another prominent historian named J.S. Grewal. So you can kind of just see here, just so that it's not, a bunch of mysterious scholars who are debating this. These are some of the people who are actually involved in the debate. All right, so moving on here quickly to the aspect of epistemology and the Janamsakhis. So this is kind of where I think some of my research is focused, is if we do indeed see that the problems with the Janamsakhis are as I was describing them, and this slide just covers what I already mentioned. What do we do with these? How do we look at them and think about, again, if we try to look at them philologically, how do we deal with the text as it is in the fairest way, and look at the contents, the way it's treated, the material, as well as the kind of metatextual manners of treating these things and interpreting them. There actually is still a living tradition of using Janamsakhis in the Gurdwaras and other gatherings of Sikhs. And so looking at all this, I think, is worthwhile in order to kind of think about what's going on here. So we cannot simply claim that the event-based causal narrative is the only way to look at the Janamsakhis, or that this was the function or the purpose of the Janamsakhis, which largely is what happens with the historiographical debate. The debate really just is about whether the events were about Guru Nanak himself, or whether the events are about the formation of community. I think we need to look back in terms of how literature and how literary writing is actually involved here. And to me, that speaks to epistemology. It has to do with theories of knowledge, the way different groups of people understand truth, interact with their beliefs in order to produce knowledge, methods for creating knowledge and interacting with knowledge, or our relationship with knowledge. And again, if you think back to the beginning of the lecture, the way the Guru Granth Sahib is treated needs to be understood as part of the epistemology. And we do know, as I mentioned, that these other texts were treated in a similar way. So we need to bring that back in, I would argue, and have a more kind of pluralistic approach to epistemology, where we're not simply privileging reason, rationality, philosophy, and science in the way we're looking at this. So given that the Janamsakhis reference the Guru Granth Sahib quite a bit, they provide, I argue, an opportunity to study knowledge production as it's occurring in the early Sikh tradition, and the way, again, storytelling or narrative was central to knowledge production. These aren't knowledge production methods that we're familiar with today, and they don't happen in classrooms like the way we're interacting as well. So they do happen in kind of early learning for children, but that wasn't what was happening here. These were Janamsakhis would have been used across the board in different settings with all sorts of people, regardless of their age. So Sakhis as witness or testimony. So the word Sakhi actually, as I kind of tried to suggest in the hagiography biography debate, when they're translated into biography or hagiography, the word Sakhi is actually often ignored. But the word Sakhi means witness or a testimonial. So this means witnessing or testifying to the truth. And I think it speaks to the way that, again, truth, beliefs, and knowledge interacted in the early tradition to create these narratives. The Janamsakhis then are compendiums that testify not to Guru Nanak's salvific prowess, and neither do they testify to the community's creation. What they're directing us to, and what they're pointing a finger to through the text is the central text itself, to the Guru Granth Sahib or Gurbani. So the kind of repetition of Gurbani every single time is an indicator of the importance of that and the need of that in order to create knowledge that extends as we go back and create new knowledge. That for Sikhs, the signal is to go back and look at the Guru Granth Sahib and actually engage with its contents to produce knowledge. So part of the structure then is important to look at, and you can't just simply get rid of it, I argue, in terms of wanting to create a history of something, whether it be a community or a person. Literary techniques then are important, we need to start looking at, I won't have time to give an example of this, but there's rife literary allusion, allegorical references, symbols, simile, metaphors, on and on and on. And to think about what was being done with these aspects. And maybe in the questions, if we have time, I can give an example, but this is where I would go in terms of pursuing a new direction with these important texts. Just a quick example here about the importance of knowledge, and actually when knowledge is referenced, the word Sakhi being used, I'll give you the English first. It says radiance without wisdom, order without attentiveness, truth without witness are valueless. So this is from the Guru Granth Sahib, and in Punjabi it says Gur bin Gyan, Dharma bin Dhyan, Sach bin Sakhi. So there's the word Sakhi, Mulo na baki. And another example, testify to the light and the jot, or your inner spirit, if you will, gets manifested. Now this is the inner light, actually, the inner flame. Experience jyoti, and darkness disappears. So in Punjabi, it says, Gur Sakhi, Jot Pargat Hoy, Jot is a Bhava, Su Arti Hoy. You can kind of see the meter if I read it in Punjabi. And again, the word Sakhi is right there. So to summarize, recognizing the nature of Sikh textuality is important if we're going to reconsider these texts in new ways. Literary analysis promises to unlock the depths of the structure and meaning of these texts, and actually help us think about and use, or start to use, I would argue, in a way, decolonizing knowledge, using other forms of knowledge in our everyday experiences with the world. This allows for greater scrutinization if we look at it from a figurative lens, and we can engage the language more thoughtfully. And the last point I've already made there with engaging with Sikh knowledge practices. So that's the conclusion of my lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If we have time, we can move on to questions. Then I'll hand off to Dr. Sahota, and we can handle that portion.
Okay, thank you, Harjeet. Very elucidating, very informative, and I think it raised a lot of questions that we could just engage with and have a conversation about. Should I just, one thing, I have a whole bunch to talk about whatever's of interest to the students here as well. And there's some that are on Zoom from this class. But just to get, things started, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the images. An image of the Chhatri, over the Guru Granth, in Amritsar. And, the Chhatri has sort of royal symbolism in the, Indian tradition, perhaps other kinds of symbolism as well. It may be from the era of Ashoka, right? That's one of the sort of maybe earliest moments when the umbrella or Chhatri is used in political ways. I'm just wondering if you have any kind of reading of that in this context.
Yeah, no, that's great. Actually, so this is really interesting and important. And it's kind of like, it's, I'm going to age myself in the way I'm saying this, but it's like the cool thing for South Asian academics to be talking about in terms of sovereignty and court culture in the early modern period. So I think what's really fascinating here, there's a kind of simultaneity between what the guru represents, whether they are embodied as a personal being. So people we refer to like Guru Nanak, Guru Arjan, Guru Gobind Singh, and the text itself. And this has been within the Sikh tradition, I think something that is a bit of a puzzle, and almost like every generation of Sikhs struggles with this in terms of where is kind of the sovereign aspect, and sovereignty in the Sikh tradition, as you even Professor Mandar, I'm sure, would have talked about a bit, is important in the Sikh tradition. It's central to the Sikh tradition. The Janamsakhis could be interpreted from a sovereign lens as well. So the symbol here, yes. So the symbol here, again, at least from Ashok, represents the person or the thing that is covered with this Kshatri or the Chhatra is the sovereign, right? So here, what's interesting, you have Guru Arjan, and you can see Guru Arjan based on the halo here around him. He's actually doing the chor, or he's there's a kind of a ornate kind of whisk that is used to keep the guru cool. And by the guru, I mean the text here, right? And so he's in the position of actually doing that duty. This is seen as a duty. The person who does it is doing seva, which is, again, it's a high kind of duty, an important one that's kept. So the position of the Kshatriya is important in the sense of it's covering the Guru Granth Sahib, and it really speaks, in my opinion, even in modern, again, this is not an old image, this is a modern one from the 20th century, the memory of the importance and the position of the Guru Granth Sahib. And it's actually going into, in the background here, this, obviously the Golden Temple wasn't always golden, this is just the brick version. In the background here, it's going in to be housed just under this central dome here. Again, so another type of Kshatriya. And each of the domes, this becomes part of Sikh architecture, is to include the Kshatriyas on the domes themselves. So there's a lot of kind of symbolism in terms of that, and the kind of the darbar or the court, and the Guru Granth or the Ad Guru Granth being the focal point or the sovereign of that. So I think, again, this is something that is, again, as I was saying, it's important to take absolutely serious that right from the beginning, this was seen as a sovereign living embodied text. Having said that, I think it's really hard to square in terms of how we create discourse around, how we create studies around the Guru Granth Sahib. And it's an exciting challenge to me as well, though. But definitely this sovereign aspect is connected to that. And the images of the gurus, even, like you can see images of Guru Nanak wearing verses of, it was a gift given to him, but he's wearing verses of the Quran. And there's actually a scholar at University, he's not at University of Michigan anymore, he's actually in the UC system, who's actually written a book called The Walking Quran, and he talks about how in Sufi practices, wearing the verses actually meant, you actually carry the body of the text on your body. And you see some of that symbolism in the way the body of the Guru as a living being and the Guru Granth Sahib as a living embodied text kind of combine. And so there needs to be some studies and some, I think, writing about that, but it's definitely an interesting aspect.
Yeah, that's great. That's really fascinating. Would you mind mentioning the name of that author of The Walking Quran?
Yeah, I think.
Or if you don't remember right offhand, it's fine.
No, it's Bruce Waris, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he's at Santa Barbara.
Interesting. I'll look it up. In any case, we have a question from the chat from one of our students, Chetan Veer. Would you say that the picture is also symbolic of Sikhism's emphasis on protecting quote unquote eternal or higher order quote knowledge as opposed to human gurus? And Chetanvir, if you could just chime in with your, elaborate on your question, that might be helpful.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
I don't know if he's able to, join us audibly or whatever through the audio, but maybe you can just take that on as you wish.
Sure. So Chetanvir, I'll start with that. If you do want to jump into the audio, by all means, please do that. So yeah, I do agree with you in terms of the idea of dharam or dharma, I guess, as if we were to anglicize it. I don't even know how to anglicize it, so I hope I did that well. I'm rehearsing my foreignness to English. But so the idea of dharma in the Sikh tradition is a singular order or a higher order to the cosmos that was created when creation happened. And human beings are interesting in the sense that we don't have to necessarily live by that order. And so protecting and retaining this order is for the benefit of human societies and for the cosmos and the world, the environment we live in. So again, that's similar to at some level, that's important in terms of the way we think about the order of these things in terms of if we want to think about hierarchical order, that maintaining that eternal or higher order actually helps us maintain the smaller orders, within our planet, societies, different geographies, different climes, different environments, etc. So having a book, again, it isn't a book for gurus, right? Or for Sikhs. It is the living kind of representation of the guru. And I should say here too, the guru, actually what the guru means is the place or the thing that removes darkness or ignorance from us. And so obviously then that helps us understand why this is seen as a living thing, in the sense of living, in the sense of it has active impact, right? So even like Bali, I'm sure you're Dr. Sahota, I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Ricoeur's work on referentiality and textuality, right? So that or even Althusser's work on how we reference or how we hail one another, right?
Right.
Interpolation, right? So our whether it's a written, so Althusser's looking more in terms of a voiced expression, if I say hey, his example, if I'm a policeman, I say hey, you turn around. Whether you're a criminal or not, you've criminalized yourself by turning around. You've created a subjectivity for yourself through which I can understand you and order you or police you, right? Texts, in terms of Ricoeur, have impact. They actually create us in certain ways through their passive form. And so the Guru Granth Sahib, in terms of one of the things I'm thinking about and interested in, is that this was assumed when this was created, that there's an active living force in this text. And the transformative active living part of that is rendered as a body. It's not a body in terms of a living kind of conscious body, but it's given that nonetheless. So it does, I think, do that for us. It does give us a way to think about and order types of knowledge. And again, you can look at one of the Sakhis where Guru Nanak actually, so just to use a Sakhi, since we are talking about Sakhis I didn't get to, Guru Nanak as a child is sent to a teacher, is a Brahmin teacher named Banda. And his father says, teach my son all knowledge, right? So in that time, knowledge is math, the Vedas, account keeping, meter, poetry, music, philosophy. And so he says, yes, of course, I can teach you all those things. And the second or third day, the Sakhi tells us, Guru Nanak is sitting there kind of bored. He's twiddling his thumbs. He's not paying attention. And so he's asked, what's the problem? And Guru Nanak says, well, you're not teaching me anything that's important. Why don't you teach me something that's significant? And that kind of starts so that's the moment so Guru Nanak's listlessness starts the conversation. And the teacher says, well, what's important? I know, and again, he says all these forms of knowledge. I know all knowledge. And Guru Nanak says, well, that's not real knowledge. And so the teacher says, well, what's real knowledge? And then this kind of starts the conversation and again, goes back to quoting the Guru Granth Sahib. So I think, again, there are moments like that do kind of, and again, we value that too. We used to anyways before STEM, that, parts of humanities and social science have an important version of knowledge that's not as concrete, but it's significant nonetheless. So yeah, I would agree with you on that one. I hope that helps. If you have a follow-up, by all means, jump in.
I think there is a follow-up, but I just want to ask one quick question before even bringing some of the students in the classroom here. And that's, on Tuesday in this class, I just went over some of the classical pramanas, of Indian philosophy. We looked at, pratyaksha, perception, anumana, inference, and shabda. These are the three sort of central ones, right? And shabda is the one that is testimony. So you can, it's a trustworthy source that you're invoking in shabda, the word in that sense. And there are other pramanas, but those you can see are kind of some significance in this, especially that last category, shabda. What's fascinating is seeing how it's being kind of reinterpreted. And I always thought that Sakhi referred back to the Sanskrit akhyana. And here you also see it being kind of reinterpreted. And so I just find that really fascinating. I don't know if you have anything to say about the kind of reinterpretations of some of the classical terminology.
Yeah, actually, so I really appreciate that you mentioned that. So maybe you guys had talked a bit about this, but, with the shamanic traditions coming up, well before Sikhism is even, near being thought of, right? Or even the historical period that leads up to Sikhi kind of being brought to the fore. You're talking 3rd century BCE kind of thing, but the rejection of kind of the Shastras and the Vedas and kind of the philosophical schools associated with those things, I think is kind of significant and a forgotten part of this, because by the 8th and 9th century, as the Buddhist monasteries, which were seminal in kind of these debates, which are kind of some of the knowledge that was created out of those debates. With the destruction of those institutions, we don't really have a sense of what happened with some of these scholars, right? Like where they went and what they were doing. And also, we don't really have a sense of how, even at the time, that could have created, ways to rethink and challenge, again, the kind of formal ways of governing or governmentality, if you want to be Foucauldian, in the way that people are governed and the kind of habitus and sociality about, working in kind of governmental systems, which knowledge is always doing, right? So in the Guru Granth Sahib, and actually by Gurdas, you read about the rejection of the Islamic schools of knowledge, the philosophical schools, as well as the legalistic or juridical schools. And you also read about the rejection of the Indian or the Brahmanic kind of schools of knowledge, philosophical as well as political or juridical. So what that says to me, and I often think about this in terms of, coming from Asian studies, I actually think about this in terms of something we've maybe lost the nuance in the way we're reading things, the way we're translating things, is that, yeah, things are getting reinterpreted and redefined. And these aren't philologists. They're not looking at their tradition in an objective way. They're enfranchised because they're living in the knowledge system that they're working in. And so they're doing what they want when they create these terms. And they're defining them mostly within the Guru Granth Sahib, but then as the textual world extends, they get reinterpreted and reinscribed. So if you think about what's happening in Asia, when you have Taoism and Confucianism, for instance, competing, one of the words that gets redefined is actually the Tao. So while Confucians reject the Tao, in the Analects, later texts actually use the word itself and are reinscribing it into Confucian norms. And the Taoists are doing the same thing with Confucian ideas, right? And so I think that you have to kind of think about these things together in that way. And so in the way what you just mentioned, to me, I think fits very well with the rejection of formal philosophical schools, and then the reinscription of some of those ideas into a new term being Sakhi, one that is, again, could be coming, if you look at it, kind of just in terms of the lexicon, from Akhian, right? And it does come from there, obviously, right? But then it's the conceptual part of it. It's what is the word then doing in this new worldview that becomes, that's a hermeneutic task, right? That becomes, how is this meaningful? How are people using this, right?
Yeah, it's pretty beautiful, actually. The questions here, I think.
Yeah.
I think that actually leads really nicely into this question. That term Jyoti caught my attention, like the inner flame or the inner spark. And during this course, I've been kind of trying to get a feel for like Sikh ideas of self and the soul. And I know in the like Vedic and Brahmanical sense, we have Atman, and then earlier in some of the like Buddhist, the Shramanic waves, there was Anatta, and I would appreciate if you could speak a little bit more about like Jyoti and how it fits into the epistemology of the self. Like, how do we know the self?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. What was your name, sir?
I'm Adrian.
Adrian? Okay, I appreciate that, Adrian. Thank you. This is actually, I also am actually really interested and fascinated about this one aspect of the Sikh tradition. And the word Jyoti to me is I think really important in terms of trying to unravel some of what the Sikh tradition is saying about the self. And there's another word which I'll get to in a second, but I'll start with Jyoti and I'll connect it to where the second term here. But so if you think about it in terms of a cosmology, the way this Guru Granth Sahib talks about creation is actually, it's kind of, obviously they wouldn't have had the knowledge we have, but they see creation as ever evolving, right? And there's actually verses which says that, in the first, there was a desire to create something. And so the creator had to render being itself in order for creation to happen. Having rendered being, a spark was created. So that's Jyoti. So the original spark is actually Jyoti. And it's that spark that takes being and starts to differentiate being into different things. And those things are the names. So without the names, you don't have, those are simultaneous for the way cosmology is understood. Like, things are created, but things are named, right? And that kind of speaks to the plurality, I say, of the very idea of Jyot. So because Jyot is singular, it's actually the vehicle of creation and evolution, and it's cutting across all of creation, like the Rig Vedas say, this what Brahma is actually in creation, but also cuts across it. It's before and after creation, right? So you can't simply think of it as teleologically. So Jyot at some level is reconfiguring some of those kind of Vedic statements in terms of cosmology. When it comes to human beings, what's interesting is we can exist in darkness, which means that, and I think this is kind of the default that humans gravitate to, is to not recognize that light is within us. And when we don't recognize that light is within us, we live in the world in a certain way. So we have a certain ontology, if you will, if we are dark beings. And I'm not referring to that in a colorist way. I'm referring to that in the sense of like, light as a principle in the universe itself, right? So it's not about fairness or color spectrums. This is about, and I'm saying that because these problems exist sociologically in India as well as other parts of the world. So it's not about that. It's kind of a different way of looking at it. So Jyot, if we kind of have that snuffed out, and the word for that is actually Nibbana, which is connected to nirvana. If that's snuffed out, the problem for us is we exist in kind of the world of duality or non-duality, which is where Brahman and Atman come in, so Advaita and non-dualism. But what the kind of idea in the Sikh tradition is that the seminal task is actually to relight that flame within us. And that flame is actually a single entity. So it speaks to the singularity of all creation and therefore the equality of all things and the need for equity across creation, right? So if you light that, then you change the way you exist and you will then defend that stuff. And so that then becomes a concept of the self, I would say, right? That's one of a bunch of ways of looking at the self. But the interesting thing too is that Jyoti Jyot Samona, or so how do you light that? That term I just said, Jyoti Jyot Samona, is actually the term that's used to kind of, how do I do that? You have to find something or someone with that light. And so this goes back to the way that the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib as a textual form, its textuality is actually conceived. It has the light in it. So it's a place where, and again, the thing I like about this is then it has nothing to do with personal charisma or, you have to look a certain way, you have to be a certain way. Again, even like, well, if you're fairer, you're more beautiful, if you're this or that. It's a text, right? So if that's the place where the light is coming from, what you need to do is then have it light your wick almost. And that's actually coming from Sufi ideas of thought. So it's really beautiful how the Sikh gurus kind of brought that in. And actually there's verses in the Quran that, the famous verse about Allah being the light and the lamp, and the flame and the wick, etc., etc. The Sufis were using that to think about the human being as well. And so the Sikh gurus kind of brought that in and made it central. The other term called home, or our kind of, I think about it as our material I, the I that wants to possess things. People translate it as the ego, but this is a possessive. There's a possessive linguistic form that says, I am myself. And so you're objectifying yourself. You're saying, I'm an object that I can speak about. I'm an object that exists. I'm an object that can have things, right? Just like you say, this is my ball. You're saying Harjeet is me, right? I am Harjeet, right? And so that form of ourself is actually not spoken about in positive ways. It's seen as something that needs to diminish. It's not something you can get rid of, but the more you can diminish that, the better it is. So it's kind of like, again, I have a biological background, so I think about it in terms of thresholds. So you want to kind of lower the threshold of home, and you want to increase the threshold of jyoti. And people who are doing that, engaged in that task, are spoken about in terms of in the positivity that they can bring to the rest of the world.
Also really fascinating.
That's great.
I'm just curious, just if you could talk about where that term comes from linguistically. How might no, is it from mama in Sanskrit, like that possessive, referring back to like aham mama, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
It's really curious. That's never really.
And in Braj, right, it's hall, right? Like the objective is hall, right?
Okay.
And so the thing that's being possessed is man, right? So hall man, like, you know, I am me, right?
Right.
Right. And so that's kind of, you know, and then again, like that aham asti as well, right? Right. So those are kind of, I think, the early forms in the indic side of things.
Right. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That's to get into sort of technical things with these languages.
But what's the word for the objectified self? What is that?
Homai.
Yeah, Homai. So it's Haumai.
Okay, thank you.
Haumai. And we can go into how it's formed. That's a little bit more complicated, but that's
Right.
for another occasion. Some Sanskrit, the medieval Prakrit, and then finally
Yeah.
Punjabi, early Punjabi even. Okay, there are a whole bunch of questions that I have, but I want to still open it up to anyone out here in the audience or in the Zoom world. Chaitan had something to say, so like maybe bring that up if there's a lull here. But anyone want to? Maggie?
Well, you answered it or kind of ended with that, but I was thinking how the Sikh pathway seems like a good tool to decolonize, you know, our minds. You know, you hear that language a lot, especially in the UC, like, just because there was so much happening before colonization happened in India, that it just seems like, yeah, a really great tool to work on those skills.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So I think, so when I think of, and actually this is kind of part of what we're doing at University of Calgary, is, you know, to me, the Sikh tradition is actually, you know, something that, a kind of world of thought whose time it's on the cusp of arriving, you know, kind of thing. Like, you know, the time of it actually, you know, and this happens with many forms of thought. You know, you have people in the past, and the moment, you know, the moment for that to become significant isn't until the future. So I think we're, again, just because of the conversations around decolonization, for them to be serious, for them to be real, I think there's something really, really beneficial in looking at the Sikh tradition, amongst other important traditions. But you see this in the Janamsakhis, actually. So Guru Nanak, I mentioned that he's, you know, goes on travels, and he spends about, you know, 15, 17 years traveling, and he's outside of India and coming back into Punjab when the first kind of Mughal emperor comes in and invades the region. So there's a kind of, so again, I don't think you can understand this just historically. You have to understand the literary aspect of it and the claims to sovereignty that the Sikh tradition has always maintained, that the Sikh gurus were sovereigns, and that the Guru Granth Sahib is the sovereign, right? And therefore all beings, the furthest extent in the Sikh tradition is all beings are sovereign, and therefore they're all equitable, they're all equal, and they all need to be respected, right? So that aspect, is written into the Janamsakhis because you have the kind of Mughal dynast coming in and starting an empire, one of the biggest empires of the, as we get into the early 1700s, one of the biggest, richest empires in the world. And you have Guru Nanak coming back at the same time. And Guru Nanak establishes a town, Kartarpur. And in a way, and this isn't in a way, but the way it's been interpreted in kind of Sikh historiography, historians from within the Sikh tradition, pre-colonial historians, quote unquote, so they're not thinking about history again the way we did, or we do, they see that as him establishing his rule, right? And what the other gurus are doing after that, they're not teachers, and that's why I wrote the word Badsha in there. They're sovereigns, and so they're actually extending that rule. They establish other kingdoms or other cities in the kingdom, quote unquote. They increase the following. They increase their population, if you will, the citizens, right? And they're eventually in loggerheads with the actual empire. And so I think that, one of the reasons why this then is important, the question of decolonization, is that we have to reach out, I think, beyond the West. Is Western knowledge, as we know it, is colonial. And so the question then becomes, what can we look to that isn't going to colonize us, right? And so I think we need to this requires true pluralism. It has to go into and look at other traditions and see where there were active, and again, we have that within the Western canon as well, but we have to look and search out those people, those thinkers, and kind of combine those tools and think about, so we have a lot of tools from American Black radical thinkers, for instance. And I think that Sikhs and Dr. Sahota and I and some other academics are really, really invested in thinking about, Sikh thought alongside Black radical thinking, for instance, alongside indigenous futurists, right? Alongside, South American radical thinkers, right? People who are pushing against this colonial juggernaut that we're faced with. So, yeah, I think that there's, the problem always to me has been that Sikhism, and again, you colonize something by, containing it. The container that Sikhs were contained in was religion and is religion. And many Sikhs understand themselves through this religious category. And so I think the first thing that Sikhs have to do is push back and out of that and then engage with other types of radical thinking. And that's where I was saying that, yeah, like I think the moment is yet to come where some of us are working towards that. And I think there's a lot of promise in that. Dr. Mandare would be one of those people as well.
We can maybe continue on this philosophical vein because I have a whole bunch of things to follow that up with, but I'm still open to other people entering the conversation regarding anything from earlier moments of the lecture, regarding textuality, regarding ways in which Janamsakhis were categorized, either as hagiography or as biography, and then the, need to sort of break out of that that sort of duality, really,
Right.
There's kind of Vaitavad dualism that is at play there. So if there are questions regarding any of those aspects, this is a good time to bring those up. But I wanted to go just, I can maybe think of something in the meantime, and then we'll, I'll come back. But this whole idea of nama that you brought up with respect to creation and the various entities that are, in some sense, given sort of definition through the name, and the name becomes such a prominent sort of streak of theological thinking, of the discourses within Sikhi in such an earlier early phase, even pre-Nanak with Kabir using the terms nama, now, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And Zimmer, it's fascinating that he brings up this category as well, from a much earlier period. And he always thinks of it as connecting with, it's a compound, actually, nama rupa, the name and the form. It's a interesting compound that he brings up. So just wondering if you could, elaborate a little bit. I don't even know if I have a concrete question, but it's just so fascinating to think that this term nama has such a huge field of resonance. And then curious to know, is it connected in any way to that earlier tradition of nama rupa, with the nama being like the material aspect and the rupa being somewhat kind of like the abstract forms that we, so there's an emphasis of the nama over the rupa, the materiality of the name and the materiality of the signifier in some sense. I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit, or there might be a conversation, for another time, but this is just something I thought was fascinating in your conversation here. We may be running out of time. I'll have to look.
Yeah. So I can start to answer that real quickly, and then we can kind of.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah. So I think the long and the short of it, I think nam often is seen as a grammatical term, but I think it needs to be thought of in terms of semiosis and the kind of semiotics of this, right? And so what the noun and the thing, how they're connected, and where that thing is. So I think one of the interesting things in the Guru Granth Sahib is the names are attached to the creator. Mm-hmm. All the names are actually describing the creator. They're not describing creation. Mm-hmm. What creation has are aspects of those names. And so in that way, it's related to the word kalma and ism as the way it's understood in Islamic kind of ideas, right? Yeah, so I think, to me, there needs to be a better comparative framework within which we can do these things. And that again is breaking past these categories and is decolonizing, right?
Right. Well, let's conclude the formal part here. So thank you once again. One little round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
It was really wonderful. And I'll stop the recording so we can talk for a little bit if you'd like. You have a minute?
Sure. Yeah, great.
I went to my other class, but see how the recording goes.
On the more button.
All right.
Yeah.